Good morrow, nerds. It is I. Rules like Tabletop RPG seem to be all the rage these days, but why is that? And is it a good thing? That's what we'll be discussing in this week's video. But before we dive into this topic with a light touch, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. So, as always, let's begin with some quick definitions. What is a rules light tabletop RPG? Well, apart from just saying that it's a tabletop RPG that's rules light, a more useful way to look at this would be one that actively seeks to minimize the number of rules that it has. And where it does have rules, it seeks to minimize the complexity of those rules. So it might have a very simple core mechanic without too many bells and whistles, a couple of subsystems to cover things like combat, as well as genre-related things like magic, cybernetics, spaceships, psychic powers, stuff like that. And again, where it does have these subsystems, it will make them as simple as possible. They'll generally have to avoid some of the more complex, detailed spot rules like long lists of bonus and penalties you can put on rolls, or fiddly action interactions, or certain edge case rules like things like being drowned or set on fire and stuff like that. And also, rules like games tend to use very abstract rules. Again, this cuts down on the complexity of those rules, and it means that those rules are more cross-applicable to a broader array of situations. Finally, a rules like tabletop RPG generally comes with the expectation that a lot of the heavy lifting has to be done by the GM, and in some cases the GM plus the entire group collaborating, especially in any blind spots that the rules just didn't cover. So, why would you want to play a rules light RPG? Well, there are a few reasons. First and simplest is that it means that there are just fewer rules to learn. There's no poring over one huge 600-page book, then another huge 400-page supplement, then another, just to get the spells for your character. This can mean that it's easier for new players to learn, and a better pick for people who like switching systems very often. Second, by virtue of the rules being simpler, interfacing with them in play will take less time, which leads to an effect that some like to call the rules getting out of the way. I encountered this sort of thing in my second ever RPG campaign, in fact my second ever RPG session, playing the second edition of Over the Edge. Now, Over the Edge was something of a pioneer of rules light games back when it was published back in the 1990s. It uses a very simple d6 dice pool mechanic. By default, you roll 2d6 for any tasks that an average person can do. If you have a trait that means that you're better at some such tasks, like say climbing, fighting, socializing, stuff like that, then you may get to roll 3, 4, or even 5d6. For more specialist tasks like flying a plane, performing arcane rituals, or giving someone a triple heart bypass, most people can't do that, and those that can have special traits that give them 1, 2, or even 3 dice that they can roll for it. There are some quirks like bonus and penalty dice for situational modifiers, the most complex rules for helping that I have ever seen, and of course rules for magic and psychic abilities. And that's basically it. The player version of the rules comes to about 40 pages, and although the GM version of the core rulebook is much longer, almost all of that is setting. What this meant is that 1, the rules are very easy to learn, and 2, we didn't really need to use them that often. In fact, we could go half an hour, even 45 minutes without anybody rolling any dice. It was a very different feel to the first session of an RPG that I had ever played, which was my first session of D&D 5e from the week before. And as I just intimated there, rules light games do really lend themselves to a more improvisational style of play. Generally, as a GM, you want a system that demands as much prep as you are willing to put in. If a game demands high prep and you are more of a pantser, then you are going to find yourself constantly running afoul of the rules. On the other hand, if the game demands low prep, but you are a very detailed plotter, then the system will end up feeling pretty vapid to you. So, if you are on that, I don't want to say lazier, but yes, lazier end of GMs, rules light systems are the ones for you. GMs, though, aren't the only ones who benefit from rules light systems. Players sometimes do as well. Rules light systems with less rigid character options can allow for much better flexibility and self-expression as a player. So again, if that's what you're into, play a rules light game. But nothing is perfect, and rules light games are no exception. There are definitely some drawbacks to this sort of system. And the first is that rules light games often achieve their simplicity by taking a lot of the burden of game design and rules adjudication and putting it on the GM. If the system doesn't have an answer for what happens in play, you have to provide it. If a system doesn't have rules for, say, car chases, well, you're going to have to make them yourself. And some groups really aren't going to like that. Some would rather just have everything be laid out in a rules-complete fashion ahead of time, rather than their RPGs come with secret homework for them to do. The second issue is very much downstream from the first. Relying so heavily on house rules and improvisation to make the rules work can leave your games feeling very inconsistent and incoherent, especially as a sort of chaotic GM who enjoys improvisation isn't going to be the same sort of GM who is stolid and consistent enough to make the same ruling twice. And for some players, that sort of unpredictability will make the games very unfun very quickly. And speaking of things being unfun, some groups actually enjoy interfacing with the rules. Some of this comes down to what is derisively referred to as gamism. The enjoyment of making a character, rolling dice, overcoming challenges, or things that require you to interface with the rules to enjoy them. But it's not just that these players want their RPGs to feel like a board game hybrid. As I'll discuss further on in this video, detailed rule systems can actually be good for fleshing out a narrative. A really good example of this is taking damage. If you have an abstract pool of hit points, it can be very difficult to quantify A, how much damage you've taken, and B, how much that damage has actually hurt you. D&D is the ultimate example of this, with an ever-inflating pool of hit points that goes up by God knows how much every level, where characters perform basically the same whether they're at 1 HP or at their maximum. A much more detailed system that has wound penalties for low health, critical injuries, and special effects for high damage rolls will give you a much clearer sense of what is actually going on when your character gets hit with an axe. And speaking of clarity, because rules-light games rely heavily on abstract mechanics to simplify the rules, if they go too far, or even if they go reasonably far but are just in the hands of the wrong players, then people trying to use them can find themselves falling into the imaginative gap. This is a concept that I made my first ever YouTube video about, and it's basically what happens when you no longer have any idea what's going on. If you can't imagine and quantify what 3 points of damage means, then you can find yourself slipping out of immersion and no longer being able to understand what's happening at the table. And rules-light games are very susceptible to this. They rely heavily on players and GMs being able to imagine and rationalize how the mechanics work, and for anyone who can't do that, they will just fall flat. Before we dive into how rules-light games became so popular, I want to quickly address the concept that having the rules get out of the way is a good thing. And the answer is, sometimes it can be. A highly rigid, codified rule set can get in the way of the description that a player gives for their actions. I know that what you're describing sounds more like athletics to dodge that melee attack rather than the parry skill to parry it, but in Conan 2D20, pretty much every skill substitution comes down to having the right talent. And no, you can't get talents out of order, they're on a very strict, rigid tree. If you're a level 3 talent, then you need the level 2 talent above it. However, I don't think that having fewer rules necessarily makes storytelling easier. As, well, stripping out rules does strip out restrictions and limitations. It also strips out the kind of handholds and points of reference that you can use to build a narrative. Some games have very detailed rules for degrees of success and failure. Some just have, normal failure, normal success, critical failure, critical success. And some just have success and failure. Now, of those three options, the simple success-failure is far and away the most rules-light. It is very easy to interpret. Did you meet the difficulty number? Congratulations, you succeeded. Did you not meet it? Congratulations, you failed. However, quantifying your degree of success then becomes harder. For instance, in D&D 5e, if you're rolling like a difficulty 15 check, and you roll a 15, there's no difference in outcome than if you rolled, say, a 26. That can end up feeling pretty dissonant. Now, a skilled GM will be able to use a bit of a descriptive flair to make it seem like a 15 is a narrow success where you just barely climb the wall, and on a 26 you glide over the wall like you were born for this very moment. But the system gives you absolutely no help in providing those descriptions. And so, if anything, a genuinely well-designed rule set can make storytelling easier, because it will help you generate interesting emergent outcomes that you and your players could never have thought of. It really all comes down at the end of the day to who is more imaginative, the game designer or you. If it's a game designer, you actually want a detailed rule set, because it'll be able to help lift you up to new heights that you couldn't achieve on your own. If you're the more creative one, then the designer will end up holding you back. So I don't think there's a clear answer to this beyond do what works for you. But how did we get here? Why are so many games rules light? And yes, there are a lot of rules light games floating around the RPG sphere. The biggest genres of rules light gaming in the tabletop RPG world are probably powered by the Apocalypse, which I'll admit I've never played one of those games, though I have read a few of them, and the OSR. Especially more recent iterations that base their systems off things like OD&D and Basic Expert D&D. But even in some of the more traditional tabletop RPGs, we are seeing a shift towards rules-light games. A perfect example of this is Cyberpunk 2020 versus Cyberpunk Red. Even though Cyberpunk Red's rulebook is actually a good 150, 170 pages longer than 2020's, Cyberpunk Red has a much more streamlined rule set. There are no fumble tables for you to roll on, the number of modifiers that you have to put on your roll has been vastly reduced, and although Cyberpunk Red's health and injury mechanics might come across as crunchier than most RPGs, being that they have, hit point pool with a half wound penalty, a mortal wound penalty, critical injuries, whole bunch of stuff. Compared to Cyberpunk 2020's wound track, hit location rolls, and stun saves, that's nothing. But if that's not enough for you, you can always look at how, say, D&D 5e is much simpler than, 3rd edition, or how Cubicle 7's Imperium Maledictum role-playing game is much simpler than any of the other Warhammer 40k RPGs that have come before it. The truth is, the rules-light, rules-heavy RPG split has existed as long as there have been RPGs, and this can be seen as early as the 1970s with the split in Basic and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Now, in some level, this split did occur so that Gary Gygax could cut his erstwhile collaborator, Dave Arneson, out of royalties for D&D, but it did speak to a split in the RPG hobby. There were the basic rules that came in box sets to be sold at toy stores that were aimed at younger and less experienced role players and had a generally simplified rule set. And then you had AD&D, and they really did put the advanced into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons with that one, especially into the grapple flow chart that apparently that game had. And AD&D-esque rules-heavy games would reign supreme for quite a while, throughout the 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s. With games like Cyberpunk 2020, Hardmaster, Mage the Ascension, D&D 3e and 3.5. There was a whole era of very detailed games that tried their best to simulate reality by just throwing rules at the problem until edge cases went away. But in the midst of all of this rules-heavy hullabaloo, there was something stirring in the dark depths of the RPG hobby, and that was Over the Edge, designed by Jonathan Tweet and later by Robin D. Laws. This would be the game that really kickstarted the rules-like indie genre, and it'll be followed up by other games like Feng Shui, the New Age games from Hogshead Publishing, and various other small titles here and there throughout the 1990s. It would then later be crystallized by The Forge, a very contentious RPG forum of the late 90s and early 2000s, which was home to a discussion about narrative play in tabletop RPGs. And from these forum conversations would emerge rules-like games like Fiasco, Apocalypse World, and many others. And these guys weren't the only ones making rules-like games. Now we turn our attention to the OSR. In response to 3rd edition D&D being very different to everything that came before it, a bunch of older grognard gamers started to revive and remix older versions of the D&D rule set. Some of them went with AD&D 1st edition as their basis, but a lot of them went for Basic Expert and occasionally even White Box OD&D. And it was from those latter two schools of D&D reflavoring that the modern OSR came to be. All of these forces would all eventually have their influence on the mainstream RPG sphere. This is why, for instance, games like Cyberpunk Red were much less rules-heavy than 2020, why D&D 5e is much simpler than 3rd edition, and why the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition skill list is a lot shorter than the 6th edition one. Now, that's not to say that we don't still have rules-heavy games floating around in the gamersphere. I did mention earlier that the newest Warhammer 40k RPG is much simpler than any of its predecessors, but the newest edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a lot more complex than 2nd edition. Likewise, there are games like Mage the Ascension, RuneQuest, Glorantha, and Pathfinder 2nd edition that all have very devoted followings. Not so much in spite of their very complex rule sets, but honestly because of them. And now that we've talked about how we got here, let's talk about why. Some people will be very tempted to say that it's because we got better at designing RPGs, that we realized that tabletop RPGs could not effectively simulate physics, and that it was objectively better to make things simpler. And while I do try to refrain from cursing on this channel, that's horseshit. Tabletop RPGs today are not meaningfully better than older RPGs. In fact, in some ways they are worse. The layout is often just a mess in recent RPGs. The quality of spell check and editing is in some cases atrocious. And there are many people who have quite rightly complained that art in recent RPG books has not been the best. As for design, rules light versus rules heavy is far too subjective of a debate to simply be answered by, well, rules light is better game design. It's simply not. There are things that rules light games really struggle with, and there are players who sincerely struggle with rules light games because they just keep falling into the imaginative gap with them. So no, please do not give me the whole, games are better now because we took all the rules out. That is nonsense. In my opinion, rules-light games are as popular as they are, in large part because rules-heavy games became unpopular. It's that simple. It's the changing of the trends. Rules-heavy games also have very distinct issues with them. They can be too complex, they can be unbalanced, they are unwieldy to design and to publish. And so people got sick of them. That's just what happened. Just because rules-light games are very popular now doesn't mean they will be forever. Sooner or later, people will get sick of the issues with rules-light games, the same way they got sick of the issues with rules-heavy games, and there will be a shift in the RPG fandom. And so it was, they went out of the old in with the new. And given the RPG market that we have at the moment, that might be for the best. I don't know about you, but I don't seem to think that people's attention spans are getting longer. In fact, if anything, they're getting worse. I can see from my analytics that my older viewers watch my videos for longer than my younger viewers. I'll even put my analytics up on slide to prove it. To put all this in modern parlance, the average modern RPG player is high-key such a virgin smooth brain that they legit cannot handle a Chad complex game. For real, for real. I feel incredibly cringe saying this, and I'm a zoomer. Moving on. The final reason that rules-light games seem to be so popular is that, on some level, they're just easier to design. There are fewer rules to test, they generally take up fewer pages, which means less editing, less graphic design, less need for artwork, and so overall, if you're a small indie designer working on a game in your spare time, in and around your day job, a rules-light game is just easier to make. So, to answer the question this video is all about, are rules-light games a good thing? I mean, yes, no, maybe. The answer to this is incredibly subjective, and will really come down to what you prefer personally. There will always be people who are naturally very spontaneous and improvisational, and who really hate sitting down for hours to read long books. They will always prefer rules-light games. There'll be other people who enjoy rules completeness, system mastery, and not having to be an amateur game designer all the damn time. And they will end up wanting to play games that are more rules-heavy. The trick is to understand what sort of GM, what sort of player you are, and to stick with games that match your preferred level of rules intensity. There are options out there for you. The RPG space is incredibly broad, and if you look around far enough, you will find an option that fits well for you. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. Do you like your games rules light or rules heavy? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.